Hi, I'm Eric Robsky Huntley, joining you from several weeks ago at this point on on unceded Wampanoag and Massachusetts land in what the colonists call Massachusetts. I'm a lecturer in urban science and planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and today I'm going to be talking about a collection of work and projects that I've been doing, some in collaboration with others, some solo over the last about 18 months, roughly COVID time. And yeah, let's go for it. So the sort of centerpiece of the work I'll be showing today is a tool that I developed last summer with the mutual aid Medford and Somerville mutual aid group in well, Medford, Somerville, in just north of Boston. If you're not familiar, it goes Boston, Somerville, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Medford. So we're a couple towns north of Boston proper. We were working together in a housing justice working group and trying to think of, okay, what are the sort of low-hanging fruit tools we could put together that could make it easier for tenants to act in solidarity and act in solidarity with each other and in a lot of ways exercise greater leverage against their landlords than they might otherwise be able to in the context of a sort of acute housing crisis. So just to sort of spill the beans at the front end, the way this works is you're presented with a sort of standard Mapboxy interface. Search for property. Let's use the first place that I lived in Somerville when I moved here a few years ago, 60 Atherton Street. And what it will return is a parcel. This is a parcel data set that is also linked to adjacent parcels and maybe less adjacent parcels likely owned by the same landlord. And the reason that this is novel and the reason it's useful is that even though, according to the city assessor's database, each of these parcels was owned by a different company, in this case, Trio Enterprises LLC, in this case, Elm Rogers LLC, right? Different listed LLC names. We've done some analysis that allows us to identify likely duplicative landlords. This is called entity detection, and in that way, we've sort of made a first pass at getting through one of the more difficult parts of property research, which is figuring out which owners are, for all intents and purposes, the same owner. In this case, we're looking at a bunch of properties owned by a company called Boston Investments. All of these LLCs are operating under the are run by this company, Boston Investments. So that being said, why is this important? I don't think I need to dwell too long on this, but we are in the middle of a sort of world historical crisis of housing precarity. Of course, there have been a range of measures put in place over the course of the pandemic to stopgap and sort of plug what would have otherwise been an impossibly leaky tub. But we're still sort of constantly feeling the pressure of what sort of feels like a permanently looming eviction crisis. And this hasn't been helped by an extremely fragmented collection of moratoria. There was, of course, the initial CARES Act eviction moratorium, which went into place in March, along with a series of state moratoria. Many states have had these, some have lapsed, some have not. Masses has lapsed as of October. Local moratoria have been in place. I live in Somerville. There is a moratoria there. There's also one in Cambridge. There is not one in for example, Watertown, one town over, right? So we have this really fragmented landscape of rental protections, which has created a whole lot of roiling uncertainty about how how this crisis of housing precarity is going to unfold over the medium term. And so we, in the context of this group that I was working with last summer, we were trying to think about, okay, what can we do? We were doing some public information campaigns, trying to make sure that tenants knew their rights. Obviously, we were doing multilingual bus signage. But in addition to these sort of more I guess conventional outreach tactics, we also wanted to start thinking about how to support tenants that were trying to either actually form a tenants union or who were at the very least trying to see what leverage they had could exercise collectively over a particular property owner. And this is a particularly big problem in Boston. This, if you haven't spent much time here, this is a city of double-deckers and triple-deckers. Unlike New York, unlike Chicago, certain parts of Chicago, this is a town where houses are 2 and 3 stories, small units. And what that means is that if I wanted to organize my building, well, that might just be me and my downstairs neighbor, right? There's not the same kind of solidarity that's possible in a larger residential building. I think I want to sort of break my themes up into 3 chunks today. First, I want to sort of walk through why it's really important that we do the work to identify institutional landlords. Second, I'm going to point to a concept that my colleague Ian Spangler and I are developing. This is abolitionist prop tech, basically how we can use property technology to work towards a sort of more radical housing politics. And third, it's sort of a provocation to do what I'm calling these days mapping up, drawing on the work of anthropologist Laura Nader. So why do we want to identify institutional landlords, first of all? That's a great question. There's been an enormous amount of really great research very recently that demonstrate exactly how different it is to live in a building owned by an institutional investor versus a small property owner. The work of Laura Lee Raymond and others, the work of Dan Immergluck, the work of my colleagues here at MIT, David Robinson and Justin Steele, as well as some recent work by Henry Gomery at Princeton. These pieces all kind of make an argument slightly differently, but come together around this empirical finding, this really kind of unequivocal empirical finding that large landlords evict more. They evict more. It tends large property acquisitions by large landowners tends to predict eviction spikes. This tends to have disproportionate impacts in Black neighborhoods. Right, we can sort of go down the list, but this is one of the more disturbing things about the eviction literature is that it documents that actually race is a substantially more predictive factor than income. Right, so we can sort of run down the list of why it's important. It's really important that we focus our eyes on large institutional landholders. The trouble with doing this tends to be that while in many states, Massachusetts included, there are large, robust parcel databases that are available. Right, in Massachusetts, we have a statewide standardized parcel database, which in a lot of ways is pretty amazing. That doesn't get around the fact that many property owners do business under multiple names. And in some cases, erroneously list addresses, either to benefit from certain tax exemptions or whatever it is. There are a range of reasons that property owners tend to operate under multiple names. So though we have a statewide standardized parcel database, there's a but here, and it's that it doesn't quite get us all the way. And even in these cases where we have fairly robust publicly available data sets, they are not kept consistently updated. The situation in Mass has since improved, but I'm showing the situation as of last I guess 2 summers ago now, where we had many towns in Massachusetts that had updated their parcel data sets to fiscal year 2020, which at that time was the most recent available. But we had some serious laggards here. Brookline, we had data going back to 2011, Boston 2016, Everett 2017, right? So there are some serious issues with the currency of available data sets. And so what this means is that in our case, we spent a whole lot of undue time building scrapers and diving into the back ends of municipal GIS products. It turns out that most of these are fairly flimsy, so you can get into the back end pretty easily if you dig into your developer tools. But we did spend a whole lot of time building silly parcel scrapers. These are all available on my GitLab, which I'll share a link to at the end of the talk. But of course, even if we have all the parcels, we still have this problem. So I've thrown up a collection of sort of hypothetical characters here. We have this is exactly the problem that we're talking about, right? We have a bunch of different. None of these we couldn't simply these would not dissolve, right? I can't group by these. I have 2 different listed owners. I have 3 significantly different spellings of our co-owner, one of which is listed as a life estate, the other as a trust. The other apparently is an individual, with slight variations on a street, right? One in which we've dropped a unit number with unit written out, number 2, right? So this is sort of a classic deduplication problem. And so we needed to put together some tools that allowed us to do the deduplication. And the reason we need tools, right? The reason we need to go to large computational tools is that while we could infer that these 3 records are the same, we can't possibly do that for hundreds of thousands of parcels, or if we're working at the statewide scale, millions and millions of parcels. So we enlisted the help of a Python package called dedupe.io. It's pretty simple to use. I would encourage you, if you're facing this kind of problem, to dig into it. And this is a supervised machine learning approach that uses an active learning labeling process, whereby you can sort of run through these things quickly in your brain, right? Do these 2 descriptions represent the same entity? No. Do these? Well, yeah, it's pretty clear that they do. Do these? Yeah, it's pretty clear that they do, right? So we're sort of going through and labeling a training data set that we use to calibrate a model that's able to predict the likelihood that a given pair of entities are duplicative. We get a confidence score, we assign a cluster, and we're sort of off to the races. Just actually as a quick note on that, one of the things that we tried to do in putting this tool together, and you can sort of judge for yourself how effective it is, we didn't want to give anyone the impression of certainty here, right? This is supervised machine learning. We're making best guesses. We are not in any way able to individually assess all of these records. We could probably find some false negatives. We don't even know if, we could probably find some false positives. We'll never know if there are false negatives. Right. So what we tried to build in a lot of language throughout the tool that gives you some sense of the uncertainty here, right? Potential properties. Over here, there was a similar set kind of language about, likely, things are likely, not definite. Things are potentially, not absolute, right? So we're always trying to build in language, which, is it going to prevent people from making leaps? No, but at the very least, we're kind of, I guess, cynically protecting our own butts. So I think this project I think of as very much in line with a whole lot of really amazing work that's going on right now that I think of what, again, I and my colleague Ian Spangler are starting to call abolitionist prop tech. We're organizing an AAG session if y'all are interested in contributing something, or if you know an awesome housing activist. But we've sort of seen an explosion of really amazing work that spans the digital humanities, spatial data science, mapping work. The sort of the reference point obviously being one of the reference points obviously being the amazing anti-eviction mapping project, whose recently published atlas Counterpoints is pictured here. But also I'd elevate the work of Just Fixed at NYC, who's put together a really astonishing tool for identifying not just property ownership, but also code violations and that kind of thing. Some reporting tools. And I will say also, just because I feel sort of obligated, that on the same day that we were releasing our tool, the Chicago branch of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, released a very similar tool. Theirs didn't do the machine learning step, but it was, similarly built and does some of the same work. So there's a lot of interest in exactly this problem, and a lot of interest in putting together tools that respond to it. And while we don't claim to have either the depth of Just Fixed at NYC or the kind of rich mixed methods repertoire of the anti-eviction mapping project, we hope that we're at least somewhat of a piece with these other pieces of work that are doing their best to demonstrate that prop tech or technology addressing itself to property is not just something that can be used to automate evictions, as folks like Desiree Fields have shown us, but also that it can be used to support tenant organizing, that it can be used to support tenants in the housing precarious to fight through the sort of veil of obfuscation that tends to surround property ownership in American cities. And so finally, is just kind of a closing thematic. I think one of the things that I find so exciting about this type of research, and one of the things that I think it signals, is a really kind of interesting turn towards what I call mapping up. Here I'm drawing on a range of largely feminist contemporary thinkers and some old anthropologists to point to exactly how important it is that our research, right, doesn't just document the impacts of eviction, though that's obviously important. It doesn't just document the impacts of housing precarity, though that's obviously important. That we also need to move beyond that kind of deficit narrative to instead do powerful analytical work, diving into the sort of mechanics and workings of not just the folks getting evicted, but the folks who are evicting them, and just to sort of name your friends. I will say that I'm drawing heavily here on the anthropologist Laura Nader, whose well-known piece "Up the Anthropologist" is a really kind of wonderful statement of this sentiment that holds up really well. She says, what if reinventing anthropologists were to study the colonizers rather than the colonized, the culture of power rather than the culture of powerlessness, the culture of affluence rather than the culture of poverty? And I think that's really the kind of key problem that we're digging into by focusing here on property owners, not just on the effects of eviction. And I'll say also that I'm not the only person who's getting reinterested in this set of concepts. My MIT colleague Chelsea Barabbas and her co-authors have started writing around this as a way of thinking through algorithmic accountability in sort of algorithmic studies. And obviously, I think of work. I just happen to love this project. This piece by Brian Clifton, Sam Levine, and Francis Sang for the New Inquiry. Check this out: white collar crime risk zones. A bunch of fancy machine learning, which feeds a sort of obviously semi-parodic device that's meant to replicate the kind of police police risk zone sort of tool, but does so for financial institutions and in a kind of cute way. So, and I'll say that we're the next direction we're moving is to do is to start actually doing some cluster mapping of large property owners. So doing some sort of analogous risk mapping of where large proportions of the housing stock are dominated by institutional property owners, and looking at how that relates to both actually existing evictions and the potential for future evictions. So that's all I got. I think I came in roughly at about time. Yeah, I just want to make sure I thank the folks with the Mutual Aid Medford and Somerville Housing Justice Working Group, particularly Dan Friedman and Bailey who were working on this tool with me, and to the folks from the Somerville Office of Housing Stability and the Somerville Community Corporation, both of whom were sort of periodically engaged in the process. And my GitLab's right there. Take a look, enjoy. Thanks, and I hope things are still all right in 2 weeks.